Hello, and welcome to 15 Minutes in the Forest. I'm Karen Snape with Virginia Cooperative Extension. My last 15 minutes in the forest was about tree identification, primarily focusing on leaves because those tend to be the easiest and the best starting point. But I had a lot of extra footage where I talked a little bit about some other features. So I'm coming to you from Camp Woods and Wildlife this week with a mixture of old and new footage to learn about some of the beyond leaves, beyond basics, tree identification skills. Another factor that can aid in tree identification is the shape of trees. Here in this parking lot, you can see oak trees that have a strong central leader, a main stem that grows pretty much straight up, resulting in a tree with a somewhat pyramid shape to them. That is called excurrent growth. Meanwhile, right here in the same parking lot, you can see this maple tree. This maple tree has decurrent growth. No one particular stem wants to be the big, tall main stem. Instead, it grows a more rounded shape to it. So here we are in that same parking lot in June. You can see the decurrent shape of the maples in full leaf and the excurrent shape of the oaks with that stronger central leader and less rounded crown. Most trees start off, most saplings are more or less excurrent. And the very, very old trees of even excurrent tending species will get a bit more decurrent. But this can be a valuable distinguishing factor in trees over most of their lifetime. This tree here also has an interesting branching pattern where the branches tend to come off of the tree at right angles. You can see that near the top of the screen there, and actually going further up as well. Those right angle branches, that's very typical of a black gum. That's one of the main ways that we tell that we're dealing with a black gum. So branching pattern can be a good hint. Another factor in the form of trees is whether they are good at self-pruning, dropping lower branches, or whether they tend to retain lower branches even when those branches have died. So you'll see here a stand of pine trees. On either side we have shortleaf pines, which are very good at dropping those dead branches. And in the middle we have a Virginia pine, which retains a lot of its dead branches. We'll go look a little bit closer. So here we have that nice clean trunk of the shortleaf pine. It does have some lower live branches because it's on the edge of this little stand of trees, but it's not holding on to its dead branches. And that clear, knotless growth form is what makes it a valuable timber species. Branches cause knots in wood, which reduces their value. The Virginia pine here, you can see, has retained many dead branches. The tree is not completely dead, it is alive, but it's holding on to these lower dead branches and stubs of branches. This is one of the reasons that Virginia pine is a less valuable pine than shortleaf. Scarlet oak also tends to retain its dead lower branches. Another feature that you can use to identify trees is the bark. Bark is an especially handy tree identification feature because it is the same pretty much all year long. You're not going to see any seasons of the year where you can't see the bark or the bark looks atypical. But despite that, it can be a bit tricky, in part because we don't use a lot of really good words to describe bark. We have a ton of descriptive words for leaves, but when it comes to bark, you'll often find foresters and dendrologists saying things like brownish grayish and loose or something like that. So it's a little harder to learn, but once you learn it, it's really valuable. So we're going to look a little bit at some different bark here in the woods and try to describe it and some of the differences that you might see in barks. So first up, we have the tight gray bark of a maple tree. And I did a whole 15-minute video on different types of maples. And one of the things I discussed in that video is how the bark on young maples is often very smooth and gray. Often looks a lot like beech. In fact, you can see somebody's carved their initials in it, which is something people do a lot. It's not their initials, it's their whole name. Wow, we know who did that. That's not uncommon with beech trees. And then as the tree gets older, and the bottom of the tree is older than the top, you can see it gets a little bit rougher. And it can actually get pretty rough, although it stays kind of a grayish brown. And the young bark, if you look further up the tree and out on the twigs, is going to have this smooth grayish brown appearance. Meanwhile, here's another tree. This one has a much rougher, furrowed bark. This type of bark is more typical of, say, a sassafras. And one of the things you can do with bark sometimes is scratch off this upper layer of bark, or scrape it off with a knife, and see what color the underbark is. So here we've got a really orangey sort of an underbark. So again, that would be typical of a sassafras. You'll also find a bright orange, almost yellowy orange underbark on black oak, for example. So sometimes you can get a good hint there. Black walnut will be a very, very dark coffee or chocolate brown. So sometimes the underbark can tell you as much as the bark that you see when you first look at the tree. Over here, we have another tree. This one is in the cherry family. It's probably a sweet cherry, which I recently learned are not actually native to Virginia. It's just that they've been planted since colonial times, so they're very common, and they're not invasive really. Just a non-native naturalized tree. But you can see here on this cherry, and you'll see it on wild black cherries as well, that has these raised ridges. These are called lenticels. These horizontal raised areas. And lenticels are an area for air exchange in the trunk of the tree. And you see these a lot on fruit trees, but also on birches, for example. So lenticels are something to look out for on the bark of a tree, especially younger twigs. Sometimes a tree will outgrow its lenticels. Here's the bark of a white oak tree. You can see that the bark further up on the tree is very light colored, and it will flake or peel off and have a shaggy appearance. Sometimes this is a place where bats can roost. It's also why white oaks are preferred by the spongy moth, an invasive insect pest. But that's a good hint for the white oak. This is the ropey bark of a black locust. So thick, ropey tendons of bark on this tree. And another thing that you can see here on the ground underneath the tree, one thing we will look for sometimes is the fruit of a tree. So in the locust case, it's a bean pod. Now these can blow around a little bit, so you have to be careful, especially this time of year when we've had all those strong winds all winter long and stuff has been blowing around. The leaves and fruit and things that you find underneath a tree may not actually come from that tree. Bark can be blocky. Most people would describe the bark of this persimmon tree as being blocky. It looks a little bit like a checkerboard, just made up of little squares, and most people would call that blocky. The dogwood also has blocky bark, although it is of a smaller scale, smaller little blocks. Something that can help at this time of year is to know a little bit about phenology. Phenology just means the season at which things happen in nature. So this is a spice bush. It's a native shrub. And you can see that it's about to bloom. These Buds are very yellow and very swollen. And so spicebush is one of the earlier shrubs to bloom in our woodlands. And so that can help you with identification. It also smells spicy or citrusy if you scratch the bark and sniff. So don't forget to use all those senses. The leaves and inner bark of black cherry also contain some cyanide. So if you nibble on a leaf, or if you just scrape the bark with your thumbnail and then smell that, it has that bitter almondy smell of cyanide in the inner bark. Another tree that has simple serrated leaves and dark twigs with lenticels on them is the sweet birch. But sweet birch, if you were to do that experiment, scratch it with your thumbnail and smell it, it would smell like wintergreen. Here's another example of phenology or seasonality in tree identification. I don't know if you can see this, but this red maple is red. The flowers are blooming right now. Those will eventually turn into baby seeds, which will also be reddish. And you can spot this sometimes from miles away. You'll see a hillside with just a red haze over it, and those are the red maples. This sugar maple next to it isn't doing that yet. These twigs are still very brownish. Some trees, like this beech, have a tendency to hold on to their leaves throughout the winter. It's fairly unusual, but it's something that beeches are most famous for doing, and some oaks will also do. Oaks are in the beech family. Beech is also a really good example of a distinctive bud. These beech buds are just so long and pointy. You really won't find many buds that are longer and pointier than beech buds. Some trees are susceptible to certain diseases, and that can be an identification clue. These trees here are black cherry trees. And as you can see, they are prone to a fungal disease called black knot fungus. On the smaller sticks, it kind of looks like poop on a stick. And this is a good hint for black cherry trees. This is also why most of the black cherry that grows here in Virginia does not have the economic value that you'll find in black cherry grown further north, where the fungus isn't as much of a problem. So all of that expensive black cherry furniture you see is coming out of Pennsylvania and New York, and meanwhile down here the trees are being disfigured by this fungus and typically have very low economic value. Here's some of that black knot fungus on a black cherry twig. So you can see what that looks like. Poop on a stick. Thank you for joining me for 15 minutes in the forest. That's all I have today. We'll see you in 2 weeks.